Sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the only one who truly understands what matters. The rain traced quiet lines down the tall glass windows of Bella Vita, a Manhattan restaurant where silence was curated as carefully as the wine list, and where power didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. At precisely 7:12 p.m., Alexander Russo stepped inside, his presence shifting the room without a single word. A man whose tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, whose watch caught the light like it had something to prove, and whose reputation moved faster than he ever needed to. But tonight, there was something different. He wasn't alone. Beside him, walking just half a step slower, was his mother, Isabella Russo, her silver hair neatly pinned, her eyes observant but slightly uncertain, as if the world around her had grown louder and colder than she remembered. The hostess greeted them with practiced elegance, her smile flawless, her tone precise. But there was a brief hesitation when Isabella responded in soft Italian, her words flowing gently, unfamiliar to the polished rhythm of English that filled the room. Alexander noticed it immediately. He always noticed everything. "Table for two," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but edged with quiet authority, and within seconds they were seated in the restaurant's most discreet corner, a place designed for privacy, for power, for conversations that never needed witnesses. Across the room, Emily Carter moved like a shadow that had learned how to breathe, her black uniform immaculate, her steps measured, her presence almost invisible unless you were looking for something more than surface. She had been working the evening shift for 6 months, long enough to understand that people like Alexander Russo didn't come here for food. They came for control, for predictability, for the reassurance that the world still bent in the direction they expected. She didn't look at him directly, not yet, but she noticed the way his posture stiffened ever so slightly when his mother spoke again, this time slower, searching for words she couldn't quite find in English. "Alexander," Isabella said, softly, her accent wrapping around his name like memory. But the server who approached their table offered a polite but confused smile, not understanding, not quite connecting, and for a moment, something small but significant slipped out of alignment. Alexander exhaled, barely noticeable, but enough to signal the beginning of tension. "She'll have the same," he said, cutting in smoothly, translating without asking, deciding without hesitation, restoring order the only way he knew how. Emily paused mid-step, a tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, her eyes flickering for just a fraction of a second toward the table. She didn't need to hear every word. She had already heard enough. The rhythm was off. The connection wasn't landing. And beneath the polished surface of the evening, something quieter was beginning to unravel. She turned slightly, adjusting the glasses on her tray, but her mind lingered on the sound of Isabella's voice, on the softness of her Italian, on the way certain words carried more than meaning, they carried history. Back at the table, Isabella tried again, her hands moving gently as she spoke, her expression patient but tinged with something else, something closer to distance than confusion. The server nodded politely, still not understanding, still smiling, and Alexander's jaw tightened just enough to betray the pressure building underneath. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he was losing something he couldn't quite define. And in a room where everything was designed to respond to him, that was a problem. Emily set her tray down at a nearby station, her movements quiet, deliberate, as if she were deciding something without fully acknowledging it. She glanced once more toward the Russo table, not at Alexander, but at Isabella, at the way her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the tablecloth, at the way her eyes moved across the room, as if searching for a familiar sound in an unfamiliar place. And then Emily turned away, not because she didn't notice, but because she understood exactly what was about to happen next. And sometimes, the most powerful moments don't begin with a decision. They begin with someone choosing not to ignore what everyone else does. The first course arrived with the kind of precision that made the entire room feel choreographed, plates placed at identical angles, silverware aligned as if measured with a ruler, and yet the tension at table 12 lingered like something slightly out of tune that only a few could hear. Isabella watched the server with polite patience, her eyes following each movement, but when she spoke again, her voice carried that same gentle Italian cadence, warm and expressive, and once again it met a wall of courteous confusion. "I am sorry, ma'am," the server replied, her smile unwavering but empty of understanding, and Alexander leaned forward just enough to intercept the moment before it could stretch any further. "She is asking about the soup," he said, his tone still controlled, still composed, but now carrying a subtle edge that suggested the evening was no longer unfolding the way he preferred. Isabella nodded slowly, though something in her expression dimmed, not frustration, not quite disappointment, but a quiet retreat into herself, as if each failed attempt at being understood pulled her a little further away from the world her son had built. Emily stood at the service station, polishing a wine glass that did not need polishing, her hands moving automatically while her attention remained fixed on the subtle shifts happening across the room. She did not stare. She never stared. But she listened. She always listened. The cadence of Isabella's voice was not unfamiliar to her. It carried the softness of northern Italy, the rounded vowels, the musical rhythm that could turn even a simple request into something that felt like a story. It had been years since Emily had last spoken the language out loud, years since she had allowed that part of herself to exist in the open, and yet the sound of it now felt immediate, alive, impossible to ignore. At table 12, Alexander adjusted his cuff slightly, a small gesture that revealed more than he intended, a sign that control was slipping in ways he could not correct with money or authority. "You do not have to worry about it," he said to his mother, his voice lowering, softer now, but still. Translating, still managing, still deciding. Isabella smiled at him, but it was the kind of smile that did not quite reach her eyes, the kind that accepted something without agreeing to it. She tried once more, speaking slowly, carefully, her hands lightly emphasizing her words, but the server only nodded again, misunderstanding wrapped in politeness, and for a brief moment, the silence that followed felt heavier than any raised voice could have been. Emily placed the wine glass down with deliberate care, her fingers lingering on the stem for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if grounding herself in something before making a decision she had not planned to make. Around her, the restaurant continued its quiet performance. Laughter at one table, hushed negotiations at another, the soft clink of crystal and silver filling the air like background music, but for Emily, everything had narrowed to a single point. She stepped away from the station, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, her presence still nearly invisible, and yet something in the way she moved now carried intention. Not urgency, not hesitation, just certainty. She approached the Russo table from the side, not interrupting, not drawing attention, simply arriving as if she had always been part of the moment. Alexander noticed her only when she was already there, his gaze lifting slightly, assessing, expecting another routine interaction, another exchange that would follow the predictable pattern he understood. But Emily did not speak right away. She looked at Isabella first, not at Alexander, not at the power in the room, but at the person who had been quietly searching for something familiar in an unfamiliar place. And in that brief pause, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a note is played that changes the entire composition. Emily's voice came softly, almost as if it belonged to the air itself rather than the room. "Signora, si preferis, posso aiutarla in Italiano." And the words did not travel far, not beyond the table, not meant for anyone else, and yet they reached him anyway. Alexander had already turned slightly, his attention momentarily pulled toward a message on his phone, his posture angled away just enough to disconnect him from the conversation unfolding beside him. And that was when he heard it. Not the full sentence at first, just the sound, the rhythm, the unmistakable cadence of Italian spoken not carefully, not academically, but naturally, fluidly, as if it had never been learned but lived. His thumb stopped mid-motion above the screen. The faint glow reflected against his watch, then faded as his hand lowered slowly, almost unconsciously. Behind him, Isabella's voice followed, brighter now, alive in a way it had not been all evening. "Parla Italiano," and there was something in her tone that did not ask for confirmation, but hoped for recognition. Alexander turned back. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a precision that suggested something had shifted before he fully understood what it was. And then he saw them. Emily standing beside the table, posture calm, expression composed, her gaze directed not at him, but at his mother, answering with a quiet certainty, "Si, signora." And there was no hesitation, no accent, no effort. Just truth. The room did not react. No one turned. No one noticed. But for him, everything narrowed to that single moment, the distance between what he thought he controlled and what had just happened without him. Isabella leaned forward slightly, her hands moving as she spoke, her words flowing now, no longer searching, no longer restrained, and Emily followed her pace effortlessly, responding with the same softness, the same clarity, describing the dishes, the flavors, the origins, but more than that, meeting her exactly where she was without needing to bridge anything artificially. Alexander remained still for a second longer than necessary, watching, listening, recalibrating, his presence no longer leading the interaction but observing it from the outside. And that shift, subtle as it was, carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. He stepped back into his seat fully now, his body turning toward the table again, his attention fixed, no longer divided. And for the first time that evening, he did not interrupt. He did not translate. He did not take control. He simply listened. Emily did not acknowledge him. Not intentionally. Not dismissively. She just did not change. Her tone remained steady, her posture unchanged, her focus entirely on Isabella, allowing the connection to form without interference. And Isabella responded in kind, her expression softening, her voice gaining warmth with every word, as if something that had been quietly missing had finally returned. A server passed behind them, the faint clink of glass breaking the stillness for a moment, but Alexander did not look away. He could not, because what he was hearing was not just language. It was something he had not realized his mother needed, something he had assumed he could provide, and something he was now watching someone else give without effort. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his eyes moving between them, searching not for explanation, but for understanding, and for once, it did not come from analysis. It came from absence, the absence of control, the absence of necessity. And in that space, something unfamiliar began to take shape. Alexander did not move to reclaim the moment, and that was where the shift became undeniable, because for a man who had built his world on control, on precision, on being the one who defined every interaction, the absence of action was louder than any interruption he could have made. He remained seated, his posture still composed, but no longer directing, his gaze steady on the exchange unfolding just inches away from him. And for the first time that evening, he allowed something to continue without shaping it. Isabella spoke again, her voice lighter now, more fluid, her Italian no longer cautious but expressive, her hands moving gently as she described something from her past, a memory tied not just to food, but to a place, to a feeling, to a version of herself that had not been present when she first sat down at the table. Emily listened with quiet attention, not interrupting, not over-explaining, simply aligning herself with the rhythm of Isabella's words, responding only when needed, her tone soft, her phrasing precise, offering just enough to guide without ever taking over. The conversation no longer felt like service. It felt like recognition. Alexander's fingers rested against the edge of the table, still, controlled, but no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience, and his eyes followed the subtle details he would normally overlook, the way his mother's shoulders relaxed, the way her voice carried warmth instead of restraint, the way the distance that had defined the beginning of the evening had quietly disappeared without him stepping in to fix it. He had always believed that connection required effort, that it needed to be managed, translated, controlled, and yet what he was witnessing now contradicted that entirely. It was happening without force, without strategy, without him. A server approached briefly, placing fresh glasses on the table, but the movement felt peripheral, irrelevant to what was taking place at the center, and Alexander did not acknowledge it. He leaned forward slightly, not to interrupt, but to listen more closely, his presence no longer positioned above the moment, but within it, and that alone altered the balance in a way that could not be reversed. Isabella laughed softly at something Emily said, a quiet, genuine sound that carried relief more than amusement, and she reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing lightly against Emily's wrist for just a second, a gesture of gratitude that required no translation. Emily accepted it without changing her posture, without amplifying the moment, her expression steady, her presence grounded, as if she understood that the weight of what was happening did not need to be acknowledged out loud to be real. Alexander watched that small exchange with a focus that had nothing to do with evaluation and everything to do with realization, because in that brief touch, in that effortless connection, he saw something he had not been able to create despite every advantage he possessed. He exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and leaned back into his chair, not in retreat, but in recognition, his usual instinct to lead replaced by something quieter, something less defined, but far more significant. He was no longer the bridge between his mother and the world around her. That role had been taken, not by force, not by challenge, but by presence alone. And as he sat there, listening to a conversation that no longer needed him, he understood, perhaps for the first time, that control was not the same as connection, and that what he had just heard was not simply language, but something far more difficult to command. The waiter returned with the wine, a deep red that caught the low light like it had something to say, and as he poured it into Alexander's glass, the room seemed to resume its quiet rhythm, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the shift at table 12 had gone unnoticed by everyone except the people sitting there. Emily stepped back just enough to allow the service to continue, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture composed, her presence once again blending into the background, but the air around her did not quite return to what it had been before. Isabella lifted her glass, inhaling softly, and spoke again in Italian, her voice lighter now, more animated, asking Emily whether the wine reminded her of Tuscany or something further south, and Emily responded with a small, thoughtful smile, explaining that the notes leaned closer to the hills outside Florence, with just enough earthiness to suggest a longer aging process, her words precise, her tone effortless. And Isabella laughed gently, a sound that felt like it belonged to a different version of the evening, one that had not existed until now. Alexander watched the exchange without interrupting, his fingers loosely wrapped around the stem of his glass, his eyes moving between the two women as if he were witnessing something he had not anticipated, something he could not immediately categorize. He was used to transactions, to outcomes, to moments that led somewhere measurable. But this did not follow that pattern. This was not a service being delivered. It was something else, something quieter, something that did not ask for recognition and yet refused to be ignored. Isabella turned slightly toward him, speaking quickly in Italian, her tone warm, almost teasing, and for a brief moment, Alexander did not translate, did not respond, did not step in to control the flow of the conversation. He simply listened. And in that pause, something subtle but significant shifted again. He was no longer the bridge between his mother and the world around her. That role had been taken from him without confrontation, without challenge, simply by someone who did not need to ask for it. Emily noticed the silence, the way Alexander remained still, the way his usual precision had softened into observation, and she did not fill the gap. She allowed it to exist, allowed him to sit in it, to feel it, to recognize what had changed without forcing him to acknowledge it out loud. Isabella reached for her son's hand briefly, her fingers resting over his for just a second, and spoke again, slower this time, her words carrying something more than casual conversation, something closer to appreciation, and Alexander nodded slightly, his gaze still fixed on Emily, as if he were trying to understand not what she had done, but how she had done it without effort, without intention to impress, without any visible need to prove herself. "You made her comfortable," he said quietly, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual edge, and Emily met his eyes again, steady, calm, unguarded. "She just needed to be heard," she replied, and there was no emphasis in her tone, no attempt to elevate the statement, just a simple truth delivered without decoration. Alexander exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the weight of something unspoken had just shifted slightly within him, and he leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxing in a way that did not happen often, not in public, not in places where control was expected to remain intact. The first course arrived moments later, placed carefully in front of them, the presentation flawless, the aroma subtle but inviting, and Isabella looked at it with genuine interest, asking Emily one more question in Italian about the preparation, her curiosity now fully restored, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who felt present again. Emily answered, her explanation smooth, her tone consistent, and then she stepped back, not disappearing entirely, but allowing the moment to belong to them. Alexander picked up his fork, but he did not begin eating right away. Instead, he glanced once more at Emily, his expression unreadable on the surface, but beneath it, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Not because she had tried to change anything, but because she had not tried at all. And in a world where everything was often forced into place, that absence of effort carried a kind of power he had not encountered before. The conversation did not rush forward, and that was what made it feel different, because in a place like Bella Vita, time usually moved in clean, predictable segments, appetizers to entrees, courses measured and controlled, but at table 12, something slower had taken hold, something that refused to follow the usual rhythm. Isabella tasted the first spoonful of soup and paused, her eyes closing briefly as if she were measuring something beyond flavor. And when she opened them again, she turned to Emily with a quiet smile, speaking in Italian with a softness that carried both approval and memory, describing how it reminded her of a small kitchen she had known decades ago, where the windows stayed open even in the winter and the air always smelled faintly of herbs and salt. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression attentive but never intrusive, and when she responded, she did not correct or expand. She simply acknowledged the memory, adding one small detail about the broth that aligned perfectly with what Isabella had described, as if she had been there, as if she understood not just the dish but the feeling behind it. Alexander watched this exchange with growing stillness, his fork resting untouched in his hand, his attention no longer divided between the room and the table, but fully anchored in the moment unfolding in front of him. He was not excluded, but he was no longer central, and that realization did not come with resistance. It came with something quieter, something closer to awareness. He had spent years building a world where he translated everything, where he bridged every gap, where he controlled every interaction that mattered, and yet now, without effort, without negotiation, someone else had stepped into that space and reshaped it without asking for permission. Isabella spoke again, her voice lighter now, asking Emily where she had learned to understand not just the language but the nuance, the way certain words carried more weight depending on how they were said, and Emily answered carefully, choosing her words with the same precision she had shown all evening. "From listening longer than I spoke," she said, and the answer settled over the table with a quiet weight that did not need explanation. Alexander's gaze sharpened slightly, not in challenge, but in recognition, as if he had just been given a key to something he had not realized he was missing. He set his fork down, finally acknowledging the shift not just in the room, but within himself. "Most people speak to be understood," he said slowly, his voice thoughtful now, less controlled, less guarded. "But you seem to understand before anyone has to explain." Emily met his eyes again, steady as before, but there was a trace of something softer now, not emotion, not vulnerability, just a subtle acknowledgement that he had noticed something real. "It saves time," she replied, and there was the faintest hint of a smile, not playful, not dismissive, but aware. Isabella laughed quietly at that, her hand resting lightly against the table as if grounding herself in the moment, and she began speaking again, this time sharing a small story from her past, her words flowing without hesitation, without the pauses that had marked her earlier attempts, and Emily listened with the same quiet attention, responding only when needed, allowing the story to unfold at its own pace. Alexander did not interrupt. He did not translate. He did not step in. He simply listened, his posture relaxed in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him, his usual instinct to guide and control replaced by something he had not practiced in a long time. Presence. The second course was brought out, placed carefully before them, and Isabella looked at it with genuine interest, asking one more question in Italian about the preparation, her curiosity now fully restored, and Emily answered with the same calm fluency, her voice steady, her words precise, before stepping back once more, allowing the moment to remain intact without extending her presence unnecessarily. Alexander picked up his fork again, but before he took a bite, he glanced at Emily, his expression quieter now, less defined by certainty, more shaped by something he had not yet fully named. And for the first time that evening, the control he had always relied on did not feel necessary. because something else had taken its place, something that did not need to be directed, only recognized. By the time the main course arrived, the evening had settled into something that no longer felt transactional, and for Alexander, that alone was enough to unsettle the framework he had spent years perfecting, because nothing about this moment could be measured or predicted in the way he was accustomed to. Isabella leaned forward slightly as the plate was set before her, her expression open, curious, her voice already forming a question in Italian before the server had even stepped away, and Emily, who had been standing just beyond the immediate circle of attention, moved in with the same quiet precision, answering before the question fully landed, her tone soft but assured, guiding the conversation without ever appearing to lead it. The details she shared were not excessive, not designed to impress, but they aligned perfectly with what Isabella cared about: the origin of the ingredients, the method behind the preparation, the small choices that turned something simple into something meaningful, and Isabella listened with a kind of ease that had not been present earlier in the evening, her responses flowing naturally, her gestures relaxed, her presence fully returned to itself. Alexander watched this with a stillness that was no longer analytical, no longer calculated, but observant in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if he were seeing a version of the world that had always existed but had never been visible to him before. He picked up his glass, but instead of drinking, he held it for a moment, his gaze drifting toward Emily again, studying the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she seemed to understand not just what was being said, but what was needed without being told. It was not the language that held his attention anymore. It was the restraint, the absence of effort. The fact that she did not once look around to see who was watching, did not adjust her tone for effect, did not claim space, and yet somehow, she had become the most defining presence at the table without ever stepping into it. Isabella turned to her son again, speaking in Italian, her tone light, almost teasing, and for a moment, Alexander did not respond in English, did not translate, did not revert to the role he had always played. Instead, he answered her in Italian, slower, less fluid than Emily, but deliberate, as if he were choosing to meet her where she was rather than bringing her back to where he had always been. The words were not perfect, the rhythm slightly off, but the intention was clear, and Isabella's smile widened in response, her eyes softening with a kind of quiet pride that did not need explanation. Emily noticed the shift immediately, but she did not comment on it, did not acknowledge it out loud. She simply stepped back slightly, allowing the moment to belong to them, her role complete without needing recognition. Alexander set his glass down and looked at her again, this time without any attempt to mask what was in his expression, not curiosity, not evaluation, but something closer to realization. "You changed the way she feels in this room," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying a sincerity that had not been present before. Emily held his gaze for a moment, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, and then she shook her head slightly, almost imperceptibly. "No," she replied, her voice just as quiet, just as steady. She was always like that. She just needed the space to be it. The words settled between them without resistance, without tension, but they carried weight, the kind that did not fade once heard. Alexander leaned back slowly, absorbing the simplicity of it, the clarity, the way it reframed something he had always assumed was his responsibility to fix, to manage, to control. And for the first time in a long time, he did not feel the need to respond immediately, did not feel the need to correct or refine the statement. He simply let it exist. Isabella continued eating, her movements unhurried, her expression content, speaking occasionally in Italian, sometimes to Emily, sometimes to her son, but the dynamic had changed in a way that no longer required translation, because understanding was no longer dependent on words alone. Emily stepped away from the table once more, returning to the quiet rhythm of the restaurant, her presence fading back into the background, but the impact of what she had done remained, subtle but undeniable, like a shift in gravity that could not be reversed. And as Alexander watched her walk away, something within him settled into place, not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of a realization he could not ignore. The dessert menu arrived without ceremony, placed gently on the table as if it understood it was no longer the center of attention, and Isabella glanced at it only briefly before looking up again, her eyes searching for Emily with a quiet familiarity that had not existed an hour ago. She did not call out. She did not raise her hand. She simply waited, knowing somehow that she would be understood, and across the room, Emily noticed without being signaled, her gaze lifting at the exact moment Isabella settled, as if the connection between them no longer required effort. She approached once more, her steps calm, unhurried, her presence neither announced nor hidden, and when she reached the table, Isabella spoke immediately in Italian, her voice carrying warmth that had deepened into something more personal, asking for a recommendation not just based on taste, but on memory, on something that would remind her of home in a way the evening had only begun to touch. Emily listened carefully, her expression thoughtful, and for a brief moment, she did not answer right away, as if weighing not the options on the menu, but the feeling behind the request. Then she spoke, her Italian softer now, more intimate, suggesting a dessert that was not the most expensive, not the most elaborate, but the one that carried the simplest balance of flavors, the kind that relied on restraint rather than excess, and Isabella nodded. Immediately, her decision made without hesitation, her trust complete. Alexander watched this exchange with a quiet intensity, his usual instinct to analyze replaced by something more instinctive, something closer to recognition, and when Emily turned slightly to leave, he spoke, his voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been present earlier. "Wait," he said, not sharply, not commanding, but enough to pause her movement. Emily turned back, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, meeting his eyes without question, without anticipation. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, as if Alexander was choosing his words with a care he rarely needed to exercise. He looked at his mother for a moment, at the ease in her posture, the light in her eyes, the way she had reclaimed a part of herself without effort, and then he looked back at Emily. "You did not have to do any of this," he said, his tone quieter now, stripped of the formality that had defined his earlier words. Emily held his gaze, steady, unguarded, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "It was not something I did," she replied, her voice soft but certain. "It was something that was already there." Alexander exhaled slowly, absorbing the simplicity of the answer, the way it reframed the entire evening without needing to explain it. He studied her for another moment, as if trying to reconcile the person standing in front of him with the role she appeared to occupy, and then something shifted, not in his posture, not in his tone, but in the way he allowed himself to be seen. "You just stole my heart," he said quietly, the words landing without emphasis, without performance, but carrying a sincerity that did not need to be elevated to be understood. The sentence did not feel like a compliment. It did not feel like flirtation. It felt like recognition, like a realization spoken out loud for the first time. Emily did not react in the way most people would have expected. She did not smile wider. She did not look away. She simply held his gaze for a brief moment, acknowledging the weight of what had been said without amplifying it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. Then she nodded slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed, and stepped back, allowing the moment to settle without extending it further. Isabella looked between them, her expression soft, understanding something deeper than the words themselves, and she reached for her son's hand again, her fingers resting lightly against his, grounding him in the present without needing to speak. The dessert arrived moments later, placed carefully before them, its simplicity reflecting the choice that had been made, and as Isabella tasted it, her eyes closed once more, her expression peaceful, complete. Across the room, Emily returned to her station, her movements the same as before, her presence once again blending into the quiet rhythm of the restaurant. But nothing about the evening felt the same. And at table 12, Alexander sat in stillness, his gaze no longer searching, no longer measuring, but understanding in a way that did not require control, only acceptance. The evening did not end with a dramatic gesture, nor did it require one, because what had shifted at table 12 was not something that needed to be displayed, only understood, and as the final plates were cleared and the quiet rhythm of the restaurant began to settle into its closing cadence, Alexander remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the table, his gaze distant but not unfocused, as if he were holding on to something that had no physical form but carried undeniable weight. Isabella adjusted her coat slowly, her movements unhurried, her expression calm and content in a way that had not been present when she first walked in, and as she stood, she placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder, a gesture that carried both gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken but fully understood between them. She spoke softly in Italian, her voice steady, her words simple, and this time, Alexander did not need to translate, did not need to respond immediately. He simply nodded, his expression softening in a way that felt unfamiliar even to himself. Across the room, Emily continued her work, her presence once again part of the quiet machinery of the restaurant, her movements precise, her attention steady, but there was no indication that anything about her had changed, no outward sign that the evening had altered the balance of anything at all. And that, more than anything, held his attention. Because in his world, change was always visible, always measured, always tied to action or outcome. But this had been different. This had been subtle, intentional without appearing so, powerful without ever demanding recognition. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket with the same habitual precision, but his movements carried less urgency now, less need to assert control over the space around him. Isabella moved toward the exit, pausing briefly near the door, her eyes scanning the room until they found Emily once more, and she offered a small nod, a gesture that needed no translation, no explanation, just acknowledgement. Emily returned it with the same quiet grace, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if moments like this were not rare, not extraordinary, but simply part of understanding how to exist within them. Alexander followed a few steps behind, but before he reached the door, he stopped. Not abruptly, not in a way that drew attention, just enough to create a pause that did not belong to the flow of the room. He turned slightly, his gaze moving across the space until it settled on Emily again, and for a brief moment, everything else seemed to fall away, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer held the same relevance. He did not call out to her. He did not approach. He simply looked, as if committing something to memory that he could not afford to misplace. Then, without a word, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture so small it could have been overlooked, but deliberate enough to carry meaning, and Emily acknowledged it with